Well, thank you, Marissa. Thank you for those very kind words of introduction. I'd like to thank everyone for coming along on such a beautiful evening when there is so much else going on in Boston. So it's very nice that you've come along this evening, and I hope you'll take Marissa's advice to buy books at the independent bookstores. I have spotted a couple while sitting waiting for this to start. There's one called Robot Uprisings. How could you not want to buy a book called Robot Uprisings? But anyway, okay, so I'm here this evening to talk a little bit about this new book that Marissa just mentioned, War, What Is It Good For? I'm sure everybody will recognize that I've stolen my title from the classic 1970s 1970 Motown pop song. I'm not, you don't have to worry, I'm not about to burst into songs. I figure you already know the song probably. Although if you had caught me 30 years ago, I might well have burst out into song at this point. Before I decided to become an academic, I tried my hand at being a heavy metal rock star, which I had a lot of fun. But it turned out that was not where my strengths lay. I realized quite quickly that I probably could do better as a historian and archaeologist than I could as a lead guitarist. And also, though, I figured out that being a historian and an archaeologist, I think, is actually a better way to answer the question than being a Motown singer like Edwin Starr, who popularized the song War, What Is It Good For? And in fact, tonight what I want to do is disagree with the song, at least up to a point, disagree with what the song says. The song, as I'm sure you know, says the answer to the question, War, What Is It Good For? Is absolutely nothing. I want to suggest that, in fact, it's not quite that simple. And the story I tell in my book, I think it's a very uncomfortable story. Basically, I suggested over the last 10,000 years, so over the very long term, war has actually created larger societies that are safer and richer than the ones people lived in before 10,000 years ago. And I think this is an important thing to say, if I'm right, because if that's the case, then understanding what war has been good for in the past, seems to me this is crucial to understanding what war might do in the 21st century. If we want the world to continue getting safer and richer, seems to me we need to know what war has been good for in the past. The weapons we've got now are more destructive than the world has ever had before, and yet the world is a safer place to live in than it ever has been before, which is a remarkable paradox that I think needs to be explained. However, having said that, the answers, I think, to this question are paradoxical and uncomfortable. So, okay, what I want to do, I'm going to first of all just tell you a little bit about the four main claims, the four arguments I make that run through this book. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think the world works in this paradoxical, bizarre way. And then finally end up with talking a little bit about the possible consequences, again, if the argument is correct. So, okay, the claims that I make in this book, the first of them, the sort of basis of the whole thing, is this idea that by fighting wars, people have created bigger societies that are more organised and have reduced the risk that their members will die violently. And this story, to understand what's happened, I think you've got to go back a long way. You've got to go back about 15,000 years to the end of the last ice age. And if you could just teleport back 15,000 years, you would find a world where everybody in the world lived in very small groups. I mean, it seems like a dozen, 20 people was a normal size for a group. Tiny groups, very few structures and constraints on the way people do things, which meant that when people fall out, which people inevitably do fall out, violence is always available as an option to settle disputes. I mean, as it is in the modern world. Just that in prehistoric times, there were far fewer constraints on people using violence to settle their problems. And the result, it now seems, more and more anthropologists and archaeologists are coming to this conclusion. The result was that in prehistoric Stone Age societies, rates of violent death regularly would run as high as 10 to 20%, which is a kind of terrifying number. You think 1 in 10, even 1 in 5 people dying violently. Now, if we fast forward to the 20th century, famous as a century that has the biggest wars ever fought, 2 world wars, nuclear weapons get used, genocides are committed, In the 20th century, somewhere between 100 million and 200 million people die violently, which is an astronomical number. But something like 10 billion people lived during the 20th century. This is a 1 to 2% rate of violent death. So a 90% fall in the rates of violent death over 10,000 years. We are 10 times less likely, when I say we, I mean the entire planet here, not just people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 10 times less likely to die than we would have been if we'd lived back in the Stone Age. Now that's a surprising statistic, but I think the explanation for it is more surprising still. And the explanation, it seems to me, is that starting about 10,000 to 15,000 years ago in some parts of the world and spreading out from there, the population rises, the world gets more and more crowded, and increasingly when two tribes go to war, now if one starts losing, it can't just run away the way you could do in the Ice Age world of hunters and gatherers, which is very uncrowded. You could go off and hunt and gather somewhere else. Increasingly, you can't do that. And what we see happening more and more is that the winners of war swallow up the losers and form a larger society. And swallow up, yeah, obviously a metaphor. The process was, horribly violent. Murder, killing, dispossession, rape, all kinds of terrible things happened. But the process produces bigger and bigger societies. Now, as this happens, the people who run these societies find that the only way to hold them together is to develop more and more complex, sophisticated governments to hold everything together. But they also find something else. That pressure starts building on them to pacify the societies they rule over. And this happens not because these rulers are angels and care only for the well-being of their subjects. They're not. These are the masters of violence. These are guys who are particularly good at killing people. That's how they get to be the big chiefs. The pressure grows because, if say, my tribe has just conquered your tribe, what I really, really want in the world, in life, is for you to all get up every morning, go and plough your fields, come home peacefully at the end of the day, and pay your taxes to me. If you have a dispute with your neighbour, I want you to submit it to resolution by some judge that I will appoint. I do not want you killing your neighbours every time you quarrel with them, burning down their houses and destroying their fields, because that impacts me, the ruler. I don't get as much tax. I don't get to have 50,000 virgins in my harem or whatever other thing I feel is vitally important. It's a bad thing for rulers to have violent people under them. So the rulers are under pressure to pacify these societies. And basically, the more successful you are as a ruler in doing this, the more successful you're likely to be as a ruler overall. And of course, there are lots of exceptions to the pattern. It's easy to think that exceptional cases. In the book, I call this the "what about Hitler" problem. And to say Hitler fits this mold would obviously be a very peculiar claim. There's lots of guys like that. Pick your own mad dictator, basically. And yet, in spite of the constant run of genocidal maniacs, overall, the big pattern is toward more and more pacification. This is the long-term trend, unintended consequence. But the consequence of the violence of the wars, all the same, is a 90% fall in the rates of violent death across this 10,000-year period. It's a weird thing, but war made states, and states then made peace. This seems to be the big story. So that's the first claim, the sort of big foundational claim in the book. My second claim is that we can actually go a little bit further with this. In addition to making people safer, the wars that created these states also made them more prosperous. And again, the wars are terrible, bloody events, but over the centuries, conquerors and conquered alike end up being better off. And we see this again and again throughout history. The classic example, to my mind, comes from a Roman writer named Tacitus, who describes a battle that took place somewhere, we don't know where exactly, in the far north of Scotland in the year AD 83. And it's a famous battle scene. He describes the Caledonian chief rallying all his guys to fight the Romans, gives this big stirring speech before the battle. And the climax of this speech, he's talking about the Romans, and he says, "They call stealing, killing, and rape by the lying name of government. They create a wasteland and call it a peace." This is what Calchicus says. And this big battle is fought. The Romans win it hands down, annihilate the Caledonians, burn everything in sight. Tacitus says the next morning the sun comes up and there's not a sound to be heard for miles around because everyone is dead. Very much creating a wasteland, like the Caledonian chief said. And yet, The Roman army then turns around and marches back into the parts of Britain it conquered some years before. The further it goes into Roman conquered territory, the more peaceful and prosperous the landscape becomes. This is a weird paradox. Create a wasteland, and yet, by ancient standards, it turns into a wonderland. I think, in fact, the lesson to learn is that both these descriptions, the wasteland and the wonderland, both apply. We see this over and over again through history. Conquerors cause a great spike in deaths. The conquests are always violent. But then if you come back a century, 2 centuries later, you find peace and prosperity